The river was low and mean that autumn, the color of weak tea, and Temperance Whitlock stood on its bank at 34 years old with $14 sewn into the hem of her only good dress and nowhere in the world that would call itself Hayes. Her husband's own brother, Silas Coombe, had put her out of the house she'd scrubbed and mended for 9 years, telling the whole of Miller's Bend that a widow with no children and no land brought nothing but bad luck to a family's name. With those $14, every cent she owned on this earth, she did not buy bread, and she did not buy a room. She walked down to the county auction at the landing and bid on the one thing nobody else in Miller's Bend would touch, the rotted, half-sunken hull of the old ferry Constance, resting in the mud shallows where she had lain forgotten for 8 long years. The crowd laughed. The auctioneer laughed loudest of all. But sealed somewhere inside that drowned and ruined hull was a secret that had been waiting 8 years for someone honest enough to find it. A secret that would not only save Temperance Whitlock, but would settle a debt the town of Miller's Bend didn't even know it was owed. Settle in, and let us tell you the story of Temperance Whitlock. If you're watching this from a place that feels forgotten, left behind, or written off by everyone around you, tell us where you're watching from in the comments. We'd love to know. Temperance had been born Temperance and Boyd on a stretch of the Missouri riverbank not 3 miles from where she now stood shivering in the cold, and she had grown up in the sound of hammers on wood and the smell of pitch and tar. Her father, Josiah Boyd, was a boat caulker and hull mender by trade, a broad, quiet man with hands like tanned leather who could look at a wrecked and waterlogged vessel that every other man in the county had condemned to the scrap fire and sea. Somehow, the good was still living beneath the rut. Folks brought him their ruined skiffs and their split-seam flatboats, their barges that had run aground on sandbars and split their planking on hidden snags, and more often than the town expected, Josiah Boyd sent them home floating. Wood remembers what it was built to do. Temperance, he used to tell her, kneeling beside her in the sawdust with a caulking iron in his hand while she watched, barely tall enough to see over the gunwale. A hull isn't finished being useful just because it's been sitting underwater. You clean it out, you find where it's still sound, and you build up from there, same as people. She did not know, as a girl of 7 or 8, how many times in her life she would need to remember those words, but she held on to them the way other children held on to lullabies. Her mother, Ruth Boyd, not to be confused with the school teacher Ruth Calloway who would come to matter so much later in this story, had died of a fever when Temperance was 11, and it was her father who raised her after that, teaching her not only caulking and joinery but the patience of a craftsman who never believed anything was truly beyond saving. She grew into a young woman who was handy with a plane and a chisel in a county where most women were not permitted to be handy with anything but a needle, and there were plenty in Miller's Bend who found that unbecoming. But there were also those, like the widow who ran the boarding house, and the blacksmith Henry Otis, who simply called her useful and let it be. She married Daniel Whitlock when she was 22, a gentle riverman with an easy laugh and rope-scarred hands, and for 9 years they lived a plain, contented life in the small clapboard house on Elm Street that had belonged to his family since before the war. They had no children, though not for lack of hoping, and there were nights Temperance lay awake grieving a family that never arrived, but Daniel would take her hand in the dark and remind her that a house could be full of love even when it wasn't full of voices. He worked the river trade, hauling freight between Miller's Bend and the county seat, and she kept his books, mended his sails, and in her spare hours took in repair work of her own, chair legs, cracked barrel staves, the occasional split oar, because her father's lessons had never left her. The town thought it charmingly odd. Daniel thought it was a reason he'd fallen in love with her in the first place. Then, in the spring of 1885, a boiler explosion aboard a freight barge 2 counties upriver took Daniel's life along with 3 other men, and the world Temperance had built for herself came apart at the seams the way a polycork hull does, not all at once, but steadily, inevitably, water finding every weakness until there was nothing left to bail. Because the house on Elm Street had never been put formally in Daniel's name, it had passed down through generations of Whitlocks under an old family arrangement. His younger brother Silas held legal claim to it the moment Daniel was in the ground. Silas Coombe was Daniel's half-brother through their mother's second marriage, a sharp, ambitious man who had never much cared for his brother's plain-spoken wife and who saw, in Daniel's death, an opportunity rather than a grief. He gave Temperance 4 months to grieve and then, with the county clerk standing uncomfortably at his side, informed her that the house was needed for his own growing family, and that a widow of a situation, no children, no living kin nearby, a woman who worked with her hands like a laborer, ought to consider herself fortunate he wasn't charging her back rent. He said it within earshot of half the town, at the church social no less, and it was Silas who first called her cursed, who first suggested, loud enough for the pews to hear, that bad luck seemed to follow wherever Temperance Whitlock went, as though Daniel's death were a stain she carried rather than a sorrow she bore. Whether he believed it or merely found it convenient, Temperance never knew, but the labels stuck the way labels do in small towns, fair or not, and doors that had once opened for her began quietly, politely, to close. By that autumn, she had sold what furniture wasn't claimed by the Whitlock family, taken a small room above the mercantile that she could no longer afford past the month's end, and found herself, on a gray Tuesday morning, standing at the county landing with $14 in the hem of her dress, watching the auctioneer prepare to sell off the last few unclaimed lots from the previous week's flood salvage. Most of what was on offer was junk, broken cartwheels, a burst cistern, coils of rusted chain, and the crowd that had gathered was thin and unimpressed, more interested in the gossip passing between them than in anything up for bid. It was old Otis the blacksmith who first mentioned, almost as a joke, that the county was finally trying to unload the wreck of the Constance, the ferry that had gone down in the shallows below the bend during the flood of '79, and had sat there ever since, half buried in silt. A hazard the county had been meaning to break up for scrap for the better part of a decade, and had simply never gotten around to. $10 minimum bid, and even that's robbery, Otis said, chuckling. Wood's rotted clean through by now, I'd wager. Nothing left of her but a story and a snag for fishing lines. Temperance had not planned, that morning, to buy anything at all. She had come only because a room above the mercantile cost money she did not have, and she had thought, foolishly perhaps, that some tool or bit of hardware might sell cheap enough to let her take in mending where it can stretch her $14 another month. But when the auctioneer, a portly, self-satisfied man named Cobb, read out the lot for the Constance and asked, half laughing already, if anyone in Miller's Bend was fool enough to take a drowned ferry off the county's hands, something in Temperance went very still and very clear, the way it used when her father knelt beside a ruined hull and told her that we remembered what it was built to do. She thought of her father's hands. She thought of the word cursed, spoken from the pulpit steps by a man who had never once lifted a hammer in his life. And she raised her own hand and said, in a voice steadier than she felt, $14. The crowd laughed, the way crowds do when they've decided a person has lost their good sense, and called the auctioneer laugh loudest, asking twice if she meant it, and each time she said that she did. Nobody else bid. Nobody else wanted to. And so, for every last cent she had left in this world, Temperance Whitlock became the owner of a sunken, rotting, 8 years drowned ferry that the whole of Miller's Bend agreed was worth nothing at all. She went down to see her purchase the very next morning, walking the half-mile from town to the shallows below the bend with a borrowed lantern and a coil of rope, and what she found there might have broken the resolve of the lesser women entirely. The Constance sat canted in the mud at a stubborn angle, her upper deck long since stripped by scavengers and river weather, her paint gone gray and ghostly, willow saplings sprouting absurdly from a crack in her pilot house roof. Silt had built up around her hull like a slow brown quilt, and when Temperance waded out to touch the timbers, they were slick with algae and cold as a held breath. Anyone else would have turned around. But her father's voice was in her ears. Clean her out, find where she's still sound, build up from there. And so Temperance rolled up her sleeves and began, alone, with shovel and a bucket and 9 years of watching Daniel work a river to clear the mud from around the hull one bucketful at a time. It was on the third day of the slow, filthy, solitary labor, working her way along the port side where the hull sat lowest in the silt, that her shovel struck something that was not wood and was not stone. She knelt in the cold mud and dug with her bare hands until she uncovered a small iron-banded box, no larger than a bread loaf, wedged into a gap behind what had once been the ferry's engine housing, tucked so deliberately into the space that it could not have washed there by accident. Someone had put it there, and put it there on purpose, in a spot no casual scavenger would ever think to look. The lock had rusted through and gave way easily to a firm strike from her shovel's edge, and inside, wrapped in oilcloth gone brittle and dark with age but still, remarkably, mostly dry, she found a corncob pipe worn smooth with years of use, a set of small brass tools she did not recognize, and a single folded sheet of paper, the ink faded but legible, that read only, "The ledger is safe as long as the Constance stands guard. Tell no one but Ruth." E.H. Temperance sat back on her heels in the mud with the pipe in one hand and the paper in the other, the cold forgotten, and understood, with a certainty she could not have explained to anyone watching, that the whole town had been wrong about what they'd sold her. She did not know who E.H. was, but old Otis the blacksmith did, the moment she showed him the pipe. "Ezra Higgins," he said, turning it over in his big scarred hand with something close to reverence. "Ran that ferry near on 30 years before she went down. Best man on this river. Folks used to say, the kind you could hand your last dollar to and never think twice." He grew quieter then, and told her that Ezra Higgins had died not long after the Constance sank, quite suddenly and, some said, quite strangely, and that in the years right before his death there had been ugly talk about him, that he'd gambled away money that wasn't his, that he'd been careless with something the town had trusted him to carry, though nobody Otis knew had ever been entirely clear on what that something was. Man's good name went into the ground with him, Otis said, and nobody's spoken it kindly since. It was Otis who told her to find Ruth Calloway, the town's spinster librarian and unofficial keeper of Miller's Bend's memory, who had taught school there for 40 years and who, if anyone still living remembered the truth of Ezra Higgins, would be the one. Ruth Calloway was a narrow, sharp-eyed woman in her 70s who kept the county's only library in 2 rooms above the courthouse, and when Temperance laid a note on her desk and watched her read the words "Tell no one but Ruth," the old woman's hands began, very slightly, to tremble. She rose without a word, locked the door of the reading room, and told Temperance a story that had sat unspoken in her chest for the better part of 30 years. In the winter of 1856, a diphtheria outbreak had swept through Miller's Bend and taken 11 children in the space of 6 weeks, and the grieving town, in its sorrow, had done something remarkable. Every family, rich and poor alike, had contributed what they could to what they called the Founders' Common Fund, a pool of money meant to build the county's first proper hospital and schoolhouse so that no child in Miller's Bend would ever again die for want of a doctor within reach. The fund had grown, over 2 years of careful collection, to a sum that was, for a river town of that size, extraordinary, and because feeling ran so high about protecting it, the town elders had entrusted its final transport across the river to the county bank at Harmon's Landing to the one man everybody agreed could not be bought, bribed, or frightened, Ezra Higgins, the ferryman. Ruth Calloway, then a young school teacher, 26, had been the fund's recording clerk, and she alone had kept the original ledger of every family's contribution. The night Ezra was to carry the fund across on the Constance, Ruth said, was a night she had never once stopped thinking about. He had left the landing at dusk with a strong box lashed beneath his seat, and he had not arrived. Word came the next morning that the ferry had run aground and partially flooded in the shallows below the bend, and that the money was gone, lost to the river, everyone assumed. Also the story that spread through town would have it. But Ezra Higgins himself never said the money was lost. He said almost nothing at all in his final months, growing quiet and withdrawn and strange, and it was Cyrus Grimshaw, the founder of the county bank, and a man who had argued loudly and publicly against trusting so large a sum to a common ferryman in the first place, who first suggested, gently and regretfully, to anyone who would listen, that perhaps Ezra had gambled the fund away Dan River and staged the wreck to cover his shame. The suggestion took root the way ugly suggestions do, faster than any defense could catch it, and Ezra Higgins died 8 months later, still refusing to answer the accusation. His name ruined, the town's hospital and schoolhouse unbuilt, its grief doubled by the loss of both children and trust in the same terrible season. Ruth Calloway had never believed a word of it. Ezra Higgins, she told Temperance, her old eyes bright and fierce, was the most honest man I ever knew, and I have spent 30 years being called a foolish old woman for saying so. What Ruth's ledger revealed, once Temperance laid it side by side with a note from the hull, was a possibility that neither woman dared say aloud at first, that Ezra Higgins had not lost a fund at all, and had not stolen it either. That instead, faced somewhere on that dark crossing with an attempt to take the strong box from him by force, he had done the only thing a man of his conscience could think to do. He had deliberately run the Constance in the ground in the shallows, damaged her hull himself rather than surrender what wasn't his, and in the chaos and cold and dark of that night, hidden the fund somewhere within the ferry's own sinking body, trusting that a wrecked and worthless boat would be the last place anyone thought to look, and meaning, once the danger passed, to recover it in Clear's name, whether illness, injury from that night, or something darker had taken him before he ever got the chance, neither woman could say for certain. But the note was plain enough. Tell no one but Ruth. Ezra Higgins, the ferryman. Ruth Calloway, then a young school teacher of 26, had been the fund's recording clerk, and she alone had kept the original ledger of every family's contribution. The night Ezra was to carry the fund across on the Constance, Ruth said, was a night she had never once stopped thinking about. He had left the landing at dusk with the strong box lashed beneath his seat, and he had not arrived. Word came the next morning that the ferry had run aground and partially flooded in the shallows below the bend, and that the money was gone, lost to the river. Everyone assumed. Also, the story that spread through town would have it. But Ezra Higgins himself never said the money was lost. He said almost nothing at all in his final months, growing quiet and withdrawn and strange, and it was Cyrus Grimshaw, the founder of the county bank, and a man who had argued loudly and publicly against trusting so large a sum to a common ferryman in the first place, who first suggested, gently and regretfully, to anyone who would listen, that perhaps Ezra had gambled the fund away Dan River and staged a wreck to cover his shame. The suggestion took root the way ugly suggestions do, faster than any defense could catch it, and Ezra Higgins died 8 months later, still refusing to answer the accusation. His name ruined, the town's hospital and schoolhouse unbuilt, its grief doubled by the loss of both children and trust in the same terrible season. Ruth Calloway had never believed a word of it. Ezra Higgins, she told Temperance, her old eyes bright and fierce, was the most honest man I ever knew, and I have spent 30 years being called a foolish old woman for saying so. What Ruth's ledger revealed, once Temperance laid it side by side with a note from the Hull, was a possibility that neither woman dared say aloud at first, that Ezra Higgins had not lost a fund at all, and had not stolen it either. That instead, faced somewhere on that dark crossing with an attempt to take the strong box from him by force, he had done the only thing a man of his conscience could think to do. He had deliberately run the Constance aground in the shallows, damaged her hull himself rather than surrender what wasn't his, and in the chaos and cold and dark of that night, hidden the fund somewhere within the ferry's own sinking body, trusting that a wrecked and worthless boat would be the last place anyone thought to look, and meaning, once the danger passed, to recover it and clear his name, whether illness, injury from that night, or something darker had taken him before he ever got the chance. Neither woman could say for certain. But the note was plain enough. Tell no one but Ruth. He had trusted exactly one person in Miller's Bend with the truth, and fate had kept them apart for 30 years, until a widow with $14 and her father's stubborn faith in ruined things had bought the one vessel everyone else had written off. Word travels fast along a riverbank, and it was not many days before all of Miller's Bend knew that the widow Whitlock was not merely picking through a foolish purchase, but hauling in help young Sam Otis, the blacksmith boy, and eventually 2 other rivermen who owed Otis favors, to properly raise and clear the wreck of the Constance. The talk in town shifted from mockery to something more uneasy, and nowhere was that unease sharper than in the fine brick offices of the Miller's Bend County Bank, where Elias Grimshaw, grandson of Cyrus and its current president, heard the rumors and felt, for reasons he did not share with his clerks, a cold and specific dread settle into his stomach. Elias Grimshaw had built much of his family's continued fortune on land and mortgages quietly acquired across 3 decades from a town that had never fully recovered from that terrible winter of 1856, a town that, without its hospital, had bled families and businesses slowly westward for a generation, leaving behind cheap land and desperate debtors that the Grimshaw Bank had been, ever so patiently, buying up. He came to Temperance himself, dressed in his good coat, and offered her $40 for the wreck and everything in it, calling it Christian charity toward a struggling widow. When she declined, politely but plainly, his tone did not stay kind for long. Within the week, a county notice appeared declaring the wreck of the Constance a navigational hazard requiring immediate removal, filed, Temperance later learned, at the request of the bank itself, and giving her May 10 days to clear the site or forfeit the wreck to the county for disposal. Silas Coombe, never one to miss an opportunity to align himself with power, took to repeating in the tavern and at church that his brother's poor widow had finally proven the family's worst fears about her, wasting what little she had and now dragging the town's good name through the mud of a rotten old boat. Temperance bore the whispers as she had learned to bear most things, quietly and by working harder. With Ruth Calloway's ledger as her guide and Sam Otis's young back for labor, she worked from dawn past dusk in the cold, and on the 9th day, with a deadline bearing down and half the county watching from the bank out of curiosity or spite, they finally freed the last of the silt from beneath the ruined engine housing and found, exactly where Ezra Higgins's note had promised, a false floor no wider than a grave, and beneath it, wrapped in 3 layers of oiled canvas that had somehow held, against 30 years of river, the strong box itself. They did not open it at the shallows, in front of whoever had gathered to watch. Temperance had Sam Otis carry it, dripping, up to the courthouse steps in full daylight, with Ruth Calloway walking at her side and half a curious town trailing behind them, and it was there, before the county clerk and anyone who cared to witness it, that she broke the rusted lock and lifted the lid. Inside, astonishingly intact, lay the original contribution ledger in Ezra Higgins's own careful hand, matching Ruth's copy line for line, and beneath it, wrapped in wax cloth, the fund itself. Not the fortune rumor had built it into over 30 years of retelling, but a sum still substantial enough to make the crowd on the courthouse steps fall entirely, utterly silent. What lay in that hole, it turned out, was not treasure for treasure's sake. It was 30 years of a town's grief, honestly kept, exactly where an honest man had hidden it with his last free choices, waiting for someone who still believed that nothing broken was ever entirely worthless. Elias Grimshaw tried, in the days that followed, to argue that any funds recovered from an old county wreck belonged rightfully to the bank that had originally been entrusted to receive them, and for a moment, in a town so unused to having anything worth fighting over, it seemed he might succeed on the strength of his family's long-standing authority alone. But Ruth Calloway's ledger told a story too precise and too damning to argue with, naming not just the amount and the families who'd given it, but the very night in 1856 when Cyrus Grimshaw had publicly and repeatedly objected, on record in the county minutes Ruth still kept in her library, to letting anyone but the bank itself hold the fund, a position that, read now beside Ezra Higgins's hidden note in the strong box itself, looked far less like caution and far more like a man who had wanted that money badly enough to try, on a dark crossing 30 years past, to take it. Temperance said none of this in anger. She simply laid the ledger, the note, and the ferry's own recovered fund before the county judge and let 3 decades of careful, honest evidence speak for themselves, while Elias Grimshaw stood pale and increasingly friendless in a courthouse full of neighbors who were beginning, at last, to remember exactly whose grandfather had first whispered the word thief about a man who could no longer defend himself. The county did not send Elias Grimshaw to any cell, for there was no living witness left to swear to what had truly happened on that crossing, and the law, in the end, is often slower and gentler than justice deserves to be. But the town's judgment proved a harder court than any bench. Within a month, 3 of the bank's largest debtors had quietly moved their business to the new savings house at Harmon's Landing, and within a year Elias Grimshaw had sold his controlling share and left Miller's Bend for good, his family's long shadow over the town finally, unspectacularly, lifted. Silas Coombe, who had staked so much of his standing on being seen at the bank president's side, found himself with considerably less standing to stake anything on at all, and he never again spoke Temperance's name from the church steps. The fund itself, with the county judge's blessing and the whole town's overwhelming vote at a meeting held, fittingly, on the courthouse lawn where the strong box had first been opened, when at last the purpose 30 years of grief had always intended. The Miller's Bend Free Hospital and School, built the following spring on a rise of land above the river where every family could see it from their porch, with Ruth Calloway's original ledger framed and hung in its front hall beside a small brass plaque restoring, in careful engraved letters, the good name of Ezra Higgins, ferryman, who was found, the plaque read, to have given everything he had to protect what was not his to lose. Temperance Whitlock did not take $1 of the fund for herself, though the town, in gratitude, offered more than once, and instead asked only for the timbers of the Constant herself, which she and Sam Otis and Henry Otis rebuilt, plank by careful plank, into a small working ferry that still, to this day, carries the school children of Miller's Bend across the river each morning, named, at Ruth Calloway's insistence, not for Temperance at all, but simply the faithful. It is worth remembering, now, how this story began, with a woman of 34 years old standing on a cold riverbank with $14 sewn into her hem and nothing left in the world but a father's old lesson about ruined things. The whole town had laughed at Temperance Whitlock for buying a sunken ferry no one else would touch, had called her cursed and foolish, and was, in the same breath, sometimes, in which they called a good man a thief 30 years before her. But what lay in that hull was never really gold, or even the town's long-delayed hospital, though both mattered a great deal in the end. What lay in that hull was proof of something Josiah Boyd had spent a lifetime teaching his daughter without ever quite saying it plainly, that the world is too quick to call a thing finished simply because it has sat broken and forgotten for a while, and that it takes a particular kind of patience, and a particular kind of faith, to kneel down in the mud and look for what is still sound. Temperance Whitlock never once thought of herself as extraordinary. She only ever thought of herself as someone unwilling to let a good thing stay lost simply because everyone else had already stopped looking. Thank you for spending this time with us and with Temperance's story. If it moved you, we'd be grateful if you'd share it with someone who needs a reminder that nothing overlooked is ever truly worthless. And if you have a moment, leave us a comment and tell us this. What is a time in your own life when you found real value in something everyone else had already written off? We read every one of them, and we love hearing where our stories find you. Until next time, stay close.